A judge frames an innocent black cop thinking he's untouchable. He plants the evidence, manipulates the system, and watches as the officer's life crumbles. His career, his reputation, even the woman he loves gone in an instant. The whole city turns against him. But what the judge doesn't know? Someone was watching. Someone who wasn't supposed to hear the truth. A blind janitor, forgotten and overlooked, holds the one piece of evidence that could take down the most powerful man in town. But will anyone believe him? And can he get the proof to the right people before it's too late? This is a story of betrayal, injustice, and the one man who dared to fight back. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sun painted the city in shades of amber and gold as Officer Darius Coleman slid into his patrol car. The familiar leather seat welcomed him like an old friend, its worn surface molded perfectly to his form after countless hours on duty. He adjusted his badge, feeling its weight against his chest, a symbol of the responsibility he carried with pride, a reminder of everything he'd worked so hard to achieve. The radio crackled softly, filling the car with the usual morning chatter of dispatch. Officers checking in, routine calls being assigned, the steady rhythm of a city waking up. Darius pulled out his phone, and a warm smile spread across his face. Janelle's text lit up his screen. "Don't forget, cake tasting this weekend. P.S. Your coffee's getting cold." His heart swelled at her thoughtfulness. Darius guided his patrol car through the quiet streets to their favorite cafe, Sweet Bean. The morning air was crisp, carrying the promise of a beautiful day. The small bell above the door chimed as he stepped inside, the rich aroma of fresh coffee wrapping around him like a warm embrace. There she was, Janelle Carter, the love of his life, sitting at their usual corner table with 2 steaming cups of coffee. Sunlight streamed through the window, making her skin glow. "I was starting to think you'd stood me up," Janelle teased, her eyes twinkling with mischief. She wore her favorite yellow dress, the one that made her look like sunshine itself, brightening up the whole cafe. "And miss my morning coffee with the future Mrs. Coleman?" "Never." Darius leaned down to kiss her cheek before settling into the chair across from her. The familiar comfort of their morning routine wrapped around him like a warm blanket. Janelle stirred her coffee, her engagement ring catching the light and sending tiny rainbows dancing across the table. "I booked our honeymoon tickets yesterday." Her voice held barely contained excitement. "Oh yeah? Going to tell me where we're going?" He raised an eyebrow, already knowing the answer. She shook her head, grinning. "Not a chance. You'll find out after we say I do." Her eyes sparkled with the joy of keeping this secret. Their playful banter was interrupted by Janelle's slight frown, worry lines creasing her forehead. "I saw on the news yesterday about that shooting downtown. Sometimes I worry." Her voice trailed off, heavy with unspoken fears. Darius reached across the table, taking her hand in his thumb gently stroking her skin. "Hey, I'm careful. Always have been, always will be. It's why I'm the best cop in the precinct." He winked, trying to lighten her mood, though he understood her concerns all too well. His phone buzzed, a text from Bill Sanders. "Don't forget afternoon patrol. Northwest Sector today." The message was typical Bill, short and to the point. "That's Bill," Darius explained, showing her the message. "Duty calls." He squeezed her hand one last time before standing. As Darius started his patrol, the morning unfolded like a familiar book, each page filled with the community he'd sworn to protect. He drove through the neighborhoods he knew by heart, waving to kids waiting for their school buses and nodding to shopkeepers opening their stores. The streets were coming alive with the daily bustle of city life. Outside Morton's grocery, Ms. Perkins was struggling with a heavy box, her small frame straining with the effort. Darius pulled over immediately, parking his patrol car in a smooth motion. "Ms. Perkins, let me help you with that," he called out, jogging over to assist the elderly woman. The box was filled with canned goods for the food bank she ran. "Oh, Officer Coleman, you're such a blessing." Ms. Perkins beamed at him, her wrinkled face lighting up with genuine warmth. "We need more good cops like you in this neighborhood. Here, Take a candy bar for the road." She pulled a chocolate bar from her pocket with a conspiratorial wink. Darius accepted the treat with a laugh, tucking it into his uniform pocket. "You're going to get me in trouble with my fiancée, Ms. Perkins. She says I need to watch my sugar intake before the wedding." The familiar exchange warmed his heart. The morning merged into afternoon as Darius continued his patrol, the sun climbing higher in the cloudless sky. He helped a lost tourist find their hotel, checking his map and giving detailed directions. He checked on a teenager who'd been having trouble at school, making sure the boy was attending his classes and staying out of trouble. He wrote up a minor fender bender report, helping 2 frustrated drivers exchange information calmly. The sun was high in the sky when the radio suddenly erupted with urgent activity, breaking the peaceful rhythm of his day. "All units be advised. We have a high-speed pursuit in progress. Suspect identified as Travis Langley, wanted in connection with multiple felonies. Last seen heading eastbound on Marshall Avenue." The dispatcher's voice was tense but professional. Darius's training kicked in instantly, his body responding before his mind could catch up. He flipped on his sirens and radioed dispatch. "Unit 247 responding." The engine roared as he accelerated, his hands firm on the steering wheel, muscles tensed with anticipation. The city streets blurred past his windows as he headed toward Marshall Avenue, the sirens clearing a path through traffic like Moses parting the Red Sea. His radio crackled again with updates about Langley's location, the static-filled voices painting a picture of the chase. Darius knew the name: Travis Langley, son of real estate mogul Richard Langley. The kind of suspect who usually got kid glove treatment because of his connections, who'd probably never faced real consequences for his actions in his life. The patrol car's engine hummed beneath him as he sped toward the chase, the afternoon sun now harsh and bright overhead, casting sharp shadows across the dashboard. The city streets stretched before him like a maze, each turn holding potential danger or opportunity, and somewhere in that maze, a dangerous pursuit was unfolding. His heart pounded with a mixture of excitement and apprehension, knowing that whatever happened next would be anything but routine. Sirens wailed through the city streets as Darius's patrol car weaved through traffic. His hands gripped the steering wheel tight, knuckles white with tension as he followed the red taillights of Travis Langley's luxury sports car ahead. The expensive vehicle, probably worth more than Darius made in 2 years, fishtailed around corners with dangerous speed, its silver paint gleaming in the afternoon light. "Subject heading east on Madison," Darius called into his radio, his voice steady despite his racing pulse. "He's not slowing down. Multiple near misses with civilian vehicles." Officer Sanders's voice crackled through, thick with static. "Copy that. I'm coming up from Pine Street to cut him off. Be careful, Coleman." The chase had gone on for 15 minutes, and Darius's heart pounded with each near miss as Travis swerved between cars, forcing them to brake hard or veer aside. Innocent people could get hurt if this didn't end soon. The afternoon sun caught the chrome finish of Travis's car as it took another sharp turn, tires squealing against the pavement. "He's running out of road," Darius muttered to himself, noting how the street narrowed ahead between old brick buildings. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he maintained pursuit. As if on cue, Travis's car suddenly lost control. The sports car spun wildly, tires screaming against asphalt before slamming into a streetlight with a sickening crunch of metal. The impact echoed through the empty intersection, and steam hissed from the crumpled hood as fluids leaked onto the pavement. Darius pulled up behind the wreck, throwing his car into park and activating his emergency lights. "Dispatch, suspect has crashed at 5th and Madison, requesting medical support, possible injuries." He drew his weapon and approached carefully, staying low behind his car door as Sanders arrived seconds later to back him up, gravel crunching under his boots. "Travis Langley," Darius called out, voice firm and authoritative. "Show me your hands and exit the vehicle slowly." The driver's door creaked open with a metallic groan, and Travis stumbled out. Despite the crash, he looked mostly unharmed, just dazed and disoriented. His expensive charcoal suit was wrinkled and dusty, and a thin line of bright red blood trickled from his nose down to his chin. His glazed eyes struggled to focus on the officers, darting between them. "On your knees, hands behind your head," Sanders ordered, weapon trained steadily. As they secured Travis, Darius noticed a black duffel bag that had spilled open in the passenger seat. White powder dusted the cream leather interior like fresh snow. His stomach dropped. This wasn't just about reckless driving anymore. The implications made his jaw clench. "Well, well," Darius said, carefully examining the bag's contents through latex gloves. "Looks like we've got cocaine here, Sanders. A lot of it. Must be at least 10 kilos. Travis's dazed expression transformed into a smirk, his eyes suddenly sharp and cold. Even with hands cuffed behind his back, he radiated arrogance like expensive cologne. "You have no idea who my father is," he sneered, blood still dripping from his nose onto his silk tie. "This is going to be the biggest mistake of your career." "I don't care if your father is the Pope," Darius replied firmly, reading Travis his rights while maintaining eye contact. "The law applies to everyone equally, even to rich kids in fancy cars." At the station, Darius meticulously typed up his report, documenting every detail of the chase and arrest with practiced precision. The cocaine was logged into evidence, carefully weighed and photographed, and Travis was processed for booking. Everything by the book, exactly as it should be. The clicking of his keyboard echoed through the quiet office. As Darius gathered his things to leave, the station's atmosphere suddenly shifted. Richard Langley burst through the doors, his expensive tailored suit and commanding presence drawing all eyes like a magnet. Behind him strode a sharp-dressed lawyer carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than Darius's car, his polished shoes clicking against the linoleum floor. Langley's cold eyes locked onto Darius, burning with quiet rage. The look lasted only seconds, but the message was clear. This wasn't over. The businessman's face was carved from stone, jaw clenched with barely contained fury as he swept past toward the booking area, leaving behind the scent of power and privilege. Darius walked out of the station into the early evening air, his footsteps heavy on the concrete steps. Despite the warm temperature, a chill ran down his spine, raising goosebumps on his arms. Something about Langley's stare had felt like a promise of trouble to come. He couldn't shake the feeling that this arrest was just the beginning of something much bigger and much more dangerous. The next morning dawned gray and heavy, matching Darius's uneasy mood as he walked into the precinct. Something felt different, wrong. Officers who usually greeted him with friendly nods or casual conversation suddenly found their shoes fascinating or turned away, pretending to be busy with paperwork. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. At his desk, Darius caught fragments of whispered conversations that died as soon as he got close. His coffee mug felt unusually heavy in his hand as he watched his captain, James Holloway, engaged in what looked like an intense discussion with Judge Walter Kensington near the water cooler. The judge's voice carried just enough for Darius to catch words like procedure and consequences. Judge Kensington cut an imposing figure in his tailored suit, his silver hair perfectly styled. His presence at the precinct was unusual. Judges rarely showed up this early, if at all. The way he gestured emphatically while speaking to Captain Holloway made Darius's stomach knot. Every few seconds, both men would glance in his direction, their expressions grim. "Coleman!" Captain Holloway's voice boomed across the room, making several officers jump. "My office now!" Darius set down his untouched coffee and walked to the captain's office, feeling every eye in the room on his back. The floor seemed to stretch endlessly before him. Inside, the captain's usually welcoming demeanor had been replaced with something harder, more guarded. The morning light filtering through the blinds cast prison bar shadows across the desk. "Sit down," Holloway said, closing the door with a soft click. "We need to discuss your report on the Langley arrest." "What about it, sir? Everything in that report is exactly what happened." Darius's voice remained steady, though his heart hammered against his ribs. "That's the problem." Holloway leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "You may have made the wrong enemies here, Coleman. Judge Kensington is personally reviewing this case. With all due respect, sir, why would a judge take such interest in a routine drug arrest?" Darius fought to keep the edge from his voice. Holloway's face tightened, deep lines appearing around his mouth. "Nothing involving the Langleys is routine. You'd do well to remember that. Across town at the Langley estate, Richard Langley paced his mahogany-paneled study while Judge Kensington watched from a leather armchair, swirling amber liquid in a crystal tumbler. The morning sun caught the expensive decor, highlighting the family portraits and hunting trophies that lined the walls. "This officer, Coleman, he needs to learn his place," Langley spat, his face red with anger. "My son in handcuffs? Like some common criminal? Do you know how many calls I've had to field from our friends at the country club?" "Calm yourself, Richard," Kensington said smoothly, his voice carrying the practiced patience of a man used to managing other people's crises. "These things require finesse. Officer Coleman won't be wearing a badge much longer, I assure you. He humiliated my family. I want him destroyed." Langley's fist came down hard on his desk, rattling a nearby crystal decanter. "And he will be." Kensington set down his glass with deliberate care. "But we do this my way. Clean, untraceable. When I'm done, he'll wish he'd never heard the name Langley." Back at the precinct, Darius sat at his desk staring at his arrest report. His fellow officers moved around him like he was surrounded by an invisible barrier. Even his partner Sanders had made himself scarce, leaving behind half-finished paperwork and a cooling cup of coffee. The truth was right there in black and white. The drugs, the chase, the arrest. Everything by the book. Everything right. But now, watching Judge Kensington stride purposefully through the precinct toward the exit, his polished shoes clicking against the floor, Darius felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. He squared his shoulders, jaw set with determination. Small tremors ran through his hands, but he clenched them into fists. The truth would hold. It had to. Because if it didn't, what was any of this for? What did the badge even mean? The morning news blared from Darius's TV, jolting him awake. His coffee cup clattered against the kitchen counter as the anchor's words hit him like physical blows, the hot liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim. Breaking news. Shocking evidence suggests Officer Darius Coleman, previously celebrated as one of the city's finest, may have planted evidence during the high-profile arrest of Travis Langley last week. Anonymous sources within the department have provided security footage that appears to show Officer Coleman tampering with evidence at the scene. This development has sent shockwaves through the community. Darius's hands trembled as he watched grainy footage of the arrest, strategically edited to make his actions look suspicious. His methodical search of the vehicle now appeared sinister through the lens of carefully selected camera angles. Every movement he remembered making with professional precision was now twisted into something dark and corrupt. "This can't be happening," he muttered, grabbing his keys and jacket with unsteady hands. The familiar leather felt foreign against his skin. The drive to the precinct felt surreal, each traffic light an eternity. Radio stations buzzed with the story, each report more damaging than the last. Some hosts he'd considered friendly voices now spoke his name with barely concealed contempt. Outside the station, news vans clustered like vultures, reporters clutching microphones and waiting for fresh meat, their eager faces illuminated by camera lights. Inside, the silence hit harder than any accusation. Officers who'd shared laughs with him just days ago now turned away, their faces masks of disappointment or disgust. Some whispered behind raised hands. Others simply pretended he didn't exist. The squad room, usually alive with activity, fell into uncomfortable quiet as he passed. "Coleman." Captain Holloway's voice carried none of its usual warmth. "Internal affairs." Now. Each word fell like a hammer blow. In the conference room, Judge Kensington sat at the head of the table, his expression a perfect blend of concern and stern disapproval. Two internal affairs investigators flanked him, their faces professionally blank, notepads positioned precisely before them. "Officer Coleman," Kensington's voice dripped with false sympathy, "these are very serious allegations. We have footage suggesting you planted evidence, witness statements indicating suspicious behavior, and now," he paused for effect, adjusting his gold cufflinks, "we've discovered irregularities in your previous arrest records." "That's impossible," Darius said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I've never planted evidence. Never. Check the body cam footage, the dash cam." "Unfortunately," One of the IA investigators cut in, shuffling through papers without making eye contact. There seems to be some technical issues with those recordings from that day. They're corrupted. Of course they were. Darius felt sick, his stomach churning with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "Until this investigation is complete," Captain Holloway said, not meeting Darius's eyes. "You're placed on administrative leave. Badge and gun, please." His words echoed in the sterile room. The weight of his badge felt like lead in his hands. As he placed it on the table, he caught Judge Kensington's slight smirk, quickly masked by a concerned frown. The badge made a hollow sound as it hit the polished wood. Later in the locker room, Darius sat alone on the wooden bench, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. The room felt colder, bigger somehow. His now empty locker stood open, a bare metal reminder of how quickly life could change. His fingers traced the indent on his belt where his badge used to sit, the groove worn deep from years of proud service. Photos taped inside his locker showed happier times, him at the academy graduation, working community events, even one with Travis Langley's car from the arrest. Each image now seemed to mock him, reminders of a life that was slipping away. His fingers lingered on a picture of him mentoring kids at the community center, their bright smiles now painful to look at. Through the window, he could see Richard Langley talking to reporters, playing the role of concerned citizen perfectly. If these allegations are true, it shows a disturbing abuse of power. Our community deserves better. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. Darius picked up his badge one last time, the metal cold against his palm. Everything he'd worked for, everything he'd believed in. It was all crumbling, and he felt powerless to stop it. The shield that had once represented his purpose now felt like nothing more than a piece of metal, stripped of its meaning. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the Internal Affairs office, casting harsh shadows across Lieutenant Mason Rivers's stern face. Darius sat rigid in the uncomfortable metal chair, his hands clasped tightly in his lap as he stared at the stack of fabricated evidence before him. The air felt thick with tension, and the ticking of the wall clock seemed unnaturally loud. "Care to explain this, Coleman?" Rivers slapped down a photo, his voice dripping with contempt. His wedding ring glinted under the harsh lighting as he jabbed his finger at the image. "Sir, I followed protocol exactly. I didn't plant anything." Darius kept his voice steady despite the anger burning in his chest. Sweat trickled down his back, but he refused to show any sign of weakness. Rivers leaned forward, his chair creaking. "We have surveillance footage that says otherwise." His eyes bore into Darius with barely concealed hostility. "Then show me the footage," Darius demanded, his heart racing. "I have nothing to hide." The words came out stronger than he felt. "That's not possible at this time." Rivers shuffled through more papers, the sound sharp and deliberate. "The investigation is ongoing." Desperate for support, Darius pulled out his phone and called Captain Holloway. His fingers trembled as he dialed the familiar number. The phone felt slick in his sweaty palm. "Captain, they're saying I planted evidence. You know me." "Coleman." Holloway's voice came through cold and distant like a stranger's. "You need to take some time off. The department can't afford a scandal right now." The words hit Darius like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. "Sir, please, turn in your badge and gun, Coleman. You're suspended without pay, pending investigation." Walking through the precinct felt like moving through a nightmare. Officers who'd shared coffee with him just days ago now turned away, avoiding his gaze as if his supposed corruption might be contagious. He spotted Bill Sanders, his partner of 3 years, standing by the water cooler, paper cup frozen halfway to his mouth. "Bill," Darius called out, his voice echoing in the suddenly quiet hallway. "You know I wouldn't do this." Sanders stared at the floor, his shoulders stiff. Without a word, he walked away, leaving Darius standing alone in the hallway, the weight of betrayal crushing down on him. At the front desk, Darius slowly placed his badge and gun on the counter. Each item felt heavier than lead, like pieces of his identity being stripped away. The desk sergeant wouldn't meet his eyes as she logged the items into evidence, her fingers moving mechanically across the keyboard. The drive home was surreal. The city streets looked different somehow, colder, more hostile. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the steering wheel, trying to make sense of how quickly his world had crumbled. Every red light felt like another reminder of how his life had screeched to a halt. As he approached his apartment building, an uneasy feeling settled in his stomach. Something felt wrong. The lights were on in his living room window, though he distinctly remembered turning them off that morning. The curtains cast strange shadows against the glass. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step feeling like a mile. The familiar creak of the third step from the top seemed to mock him. When he opened his apartment door, his heart stopped. Janelle stood in the middle of their living room, surrounded by packed bags. Her eyes were red and puffy, and she wouldn't look directly at him. The engagement ring on her finger caught the light, a bitter reminder of promises about to be broken. Janelle. His voice came out barely above a whisper, fragile as spun glass. The door to Darius's apartment creaked open, revealing Janelle standing in the dim light of their living room. Her usual warm smile was gone, replaced by red-rimmed eyes and trembling lips. 2 packed suitcases stood beside her like silent witnesses to the unfolding heartbreak. The engagement ring on her finger caught the fading light, a cruel reminder of promises about to be broken. "Tell me you don't believe this," Darius whispered, his voice cracking. His heart hammered against his ribs as he tried to make sense of the scene before him. Janelle's silence stretched between them like a growing chasm. She fumbled with her phone, hands shaking as she held it out to him. "Look at this, Darius. Just look." Her fingers trembled so badly she nearly dropped the device. The screen showed hundreds of notifications, messages, and social media posts. Dirty cop's fiancé. How can she stay with him? Once a corrupt cop, always a corrupt cop. The words blurred before his eyes, each one a fresh wound to his already battered spirit. Comments from strangers who didn't know him, didn't know their story, yet felt entitled to judge. "I've gotten calls from my workplace," Janelle said, wiping tears from her cheeks. "My boss suggested I take some time off. My sister won't stop calling. Even my mother." She wrapped her arms around herself as if trying to hold herself together. Her engagement ring caught the light again as she moved. "I love you, Darius. God knows I do. But I can't ruin my life for this." Her voice broke on the last word. "Janelle, please." Darius stepped forward, reaching for her hand, desperate to make her understand. "You know me. You know I would never." She pulled away, grabbing her suitcases with shaking hands. "I need time to think. I need space." The wheels of her luggage squeaked against the hardwood floor, a sound that seemed to echo the breaking of his heart. "Space?" The word felt hollow in his mouth. "We're supposed to get married in 3 months." Their save-the-date cards were still displayed proudly on their refrigerator, mocking him. "I know," Janelle's voice cracked. "Don't you think I know that? The venue keeps calling, asking if we want to cancel. The florist, the caterer, everyone knows Darius. Everyone." Her mascara left dark trails down her cheeks. She moved toward the door, then paused. On the kitchen counter, she placed a folded piece of paper. "I'm sorry," she whispered, not looking back as she walked out. The sound of her heels against the floor seemed to count down the final moments of their relationship. Darius stood frozen, listening to her footsteps fade down the hallway. The click of the elevator doors opening and closing echoed like a final goodbye. The engagement ring they'd chosen together 6 months ago was now just another broken promise. His legs gave out and he sank onto the couch. The apartment felt too big, too empty. Their photos still hung on the walls, vacation snapshots, family gatherings, the day he proposed at her favorite restaurant. Each image now felt like a knife twisting in his chest. Memories of happier times turned bitter. With trembling fingers, he picked up the note from the counter. Janelle's familiar handwriting blurred through his tears. "I don't know who you are anymore." The paper crumpled slightly in his grip as his hands shook. The words hit him like physical blows. He'd lost his badge, his reputation, his colleagues' respect, and now Janelle. The silence of the apartment pressed in around him as night fell, broken only by the occasional distant siren that reminded him of the life he'd lost. He must have fallen asleep on the couch because the next thing he knew, sunlight was streaming through the windows, and his phone was ringing. His mother's name flashed on the screen. The morning light revealed the mess of tissues around him and the wrinkled state of his uniform from yesterday. "Baby." Evelyn Coleman's voice was thick with tears. "The news. Turn on the news." The tremor in her voice told him that whatever was coming would only add to his growing nightmare. Darius's hand trembled as he fumbled with the TV remote. His mother's sobs echoed through the phone pressed against his ear. The morning news anchor's voice filled his living room, crisp and professional, but her words cut like knives. Breaking news this morning as Officer Darius Coleman faces criminal charges for evidence tampering in the high-profile Travis Langley case. Surveillance footage appears to show Coleman planting drugs in Langley's vehicle during last week's arrest. The screen split to show grainy footage of what looked like him reaching into his pocket before searching Travis's car. Darius's stomach churned. He knew that wasn't what happened, but the video had been edited to tell a different story. "Mom, please don't cry," he said softly into the phone. "None of this is true." "Baby, I know," Evelyn Coleman's voice cracked. "I raised you better than that. I raised you to be honest, to serve God and your community. But these people on TV, they're making you look like—" "I know, Mom. I know." Darius closed his eyes, fighting back tears of his own. The weight of the accusation bore down on him like a heavy stone, threatening to crush his spirit. Meanwhile, in the courthouse basement, Mr. Henry Williams ran his weathered hands along his mop handle, the familiar texture grounding him as his small radio delivered the same devastating news. His unseeing eyes might not have witnessed the corruption, but his ears had caught every word of last night's conversation. He'd been cleaning near Judge Kensington's chambers, moving slowly and quietly as he always did, when the voices drifted through the door. Most people forgot about the blind janitor, treated him like part of the furniture. That's why they never bothered to lower their voices around him. "The footage has been altered exactly as we discussed," Kensington had said, his usual authoritative tone tinged with satisfaction. "By tomorrow morning, Officer Coleman's career will be in shambles." "Good," Richard Langley's voice had replied. "That's what happens when someone dares to touch my son. Make sure the evidence sticks. I want him destroyed." "Don't worry," Kensington had laughed. "Who would believe a disgraced cop over a respected judge?" Now, as the morning news droned on from his radio, Mr. Henry's grip tightened on his mop. 40 years of cleaning these halls, 40 years of hearing secrets and lies, deals made in shadows. He'd stayed quiet, kept his head down, done his job, but this time felt different. He remembered Officer Coleman's voice from his patrols, always stopping to say hello, always treating him with respect. "How are you doing today, Mr. Henry?" he would ask, and actually wait for an answer. Not many people did that. Back in his apartment, Darius watched numbly as reporters gathered outside the precinct, shoving microphones in his colleagues' faces. His mother was still on the phone, praying out loud now, asking God to protect her son. "The Lord sees everything," she said firmly. "He knows the truth, baby. We just have to trust in him." Darius wanted to believe that was enough. But right now, watching his life crumble on live television, faith felt like a fragile thing. The news anchor was now interviewing legal experts who discussed the severity of evidence tampering charges, speculating about potential prison time. In the courthouse basement, Mr. Henry carefully stored his mop in the supply closet. His hands found his worn jacket, and he pulled it on with determination. For 40 years, he'd been invisible in these halls. Maybe it was time to finally be seen. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Mr. Henry's cane tapped rhythmically against the worn linoleum floor of the public defender's office. The familiar smell of old coffee and dusty files filled his nostrils as he made his way forward, counting steps he'd memorized over 4 decades. His fingers brushed against the edge of a filing cabinet, 17 steps from the door, just as he remembered. Christopher Langston barely glanced up from the mountain of case files on his desk. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his tie hung loose around his neck, the silk wrinkled from too many 18-hour days. "Can I help you?" he asked. his voice carrying the weight of too many lost cases and broken promises. "My name is Henry Williams. I work as a janitor at the courthouse, and I need to talk to you about Darius Coleman." His words were measured, deliberate, each syllable carrying the gravity of his purpose. Langston sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. A half-empty coffee cup teetered precariously close to the edge of his desk. "Look, I've got 23 active cases. If you're here about Coleman, I'll get to his file when I can, maybe next week." "You don't understand," Mr. Henry said, gripping his cane tighter, the wood smooth beneath his weathered hands. "I know he's innocent. I heard them planning the whole thing. Every word, every whisper." "Them?" Langston's tone was skeptical, tinged with the exhaustion of a man who'd heard too many desperate pleas. "Mr. Williams, I can see well, that you can't see. How exactly did you witness anything?" Mr. Henry's face hardened, decades of dignity straightening his spine. "Just because I'm blind doesn't mean I don't know what's happening around me. I've worked in that courthouse longer than you've been alive. I know every crack in those marble floors, every whispered conversation in those hallowed halls." "I respect what you're trying to do," Langston said, shuffling papers on his desk, the sound of defeat in every rustle. "But a blind man's testimony, in front of a jury, the defense will rip you apart." The sound of Mr. Henry's cane striking the floor echoed through the office like a gunshot. Several heads turned in the cramped space, then quickly looked away. "You listen to me, young man," he said, his voice sharp with 40 years of witnessed injustice. "Just because I can't see doesn't mean I don't know. I heard that man plotting. If you don't do something, an innocent man will rot in prison." The office fell silent except for the hum of the lights and the distant sound of a phone ringing unanswered. Langston stopped shuffling papers, studying the elderly man standing before him. There was something in Mr. Henry's stance, in the way he held himself, that made Langston pause, a certainty that cut through years of cynicism. "5 minutes," Langston said finally, pushing aside a stack of manila folders. "You've got 5 minutes to convince me." Mr. Henry's shoulders relaxed slightly. He pulled up a chair, the metal legs scraping against the floor with a sound that made him wince. "I was doing my evening rounds when I heard voices from Judge Kensington's chambers. The judge and Richard Langley were talking." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper, heavy with the weight of secrets too long held. Meanwhile, across town, Darius sat alone in his apartment, staring at the empty space where Janelle's photos used to hang. The silence pressed in around him like a physical weight, broken only by the tick of the wall clock and the distant sound of sirens. He was unaware that in a cramped public defender's office, someone was finally fighting for his truth, that the wheels of justice were slowly beginning to turn in his favor. The morning sun barely filtered through Darius's apartment windows when the crash came. His front door splintered inward with a deafening bang that made him bolt upright in bed, his heart leaping into his throat. He'd been on the phone with his mother trying to comfort her after yesterday's devastating news, assuring her everything would be okay, even though uncertainty gnawed at his own gut. "Police, get on the ground now!" Multiple voices shouted as heavy boots thundered through his home, the sound echoing off the walls like a gathering storm. "Baby? What's happening? Darius?" His mother's voice crackled through the phone, high with panic, trembling with fear he'd never heard before. Before Darius could respond, officers burst into his bedroom, weapons trained on him. The same guns he'd carried proudly now pointed at his chest, cold and threatening. He recognized faces behind those weapons, people he'd shared coffee with, worked cases with, celebrated victories with. Their expressions were hard masks now, devoid of friendship. "Hands where we can see them," an officer barked, finger tensed on the trigger. "I'm not resisting," Darius said calmly, raising his hands. His heart pounded against his ribs, but years of training helped him stay composed, his voice steady. "Let me just tell my mother. On the ground. Now." Rough hands grabbed him, forcing him face down. The carpet scraped his cheek as someone yanked his arms behind his back, twisting harder than necessary. Cold metal bit into his wrists as handcuffs clicked tight. too tight, cutting into his skin. He could hear his mother crying through the phone on his nightstand, her sobs piercing his heart. At the precinct, officers marched him through familiar hallways. The same corridors he'd walked proudly now felt like a gauntlet of shame, each step an exercise in humiliation. Whispers followed him like shadows. Eyes darted away when he looked up, faces turning as if he carried something contagious. These were people who'd celebrated his promotions, who'd had his back during dangerous calls, who'd shared holiday parties and birthday cakes. His former partner, Bill Sanders, stood by the water cooler, coffee cup frozen halfway to his mouth. Their eyes met briefly. Bill's face tightened, guilt flickering across his features, but he quickly looked down at his shoes. No words, no support, just silence that spoke volumes about loyalty. They threw him in a holding cell, the same one he'd put countless suspects in before. The metal bench was cold and hard against his back, the familiar smell of disinfectant now sickeningly sweet. Hours crawled by as Darius sat there, his thoughts spinning like leaves in a storm. Every creak of the building, every distant voice, reminded him of better days, of times when he'd stood on the other side of these bars. When they finally led him to the courtroom, his legs felt wooden, heavy with dread. The walk down the center aisle seemed endless, each step echoing in the hushed space. But then he saw her, his mother, Evelyn, sitting straight-backed in the gallery, her Sunday best perfectly pressed despite the early hour. Her eyes were red from crying, but her chin was lifted high, dignified in her pain. When their gazes met, she mouthed the words that gave him strength. "Hold your head up, son." Judge Kensington sat on the bench looking down at Darius with barely concealed satisfaction, his judicial robes a mockery of justice. The same man who'd shaken his hand at community events, praised his service record, now wielded power over his fate with obvious relish. "Officer Coleman," Kensington paused, his lips curling slightly in what might have been a smile under different circumstances. "Or should I say, former Officer Coleman, this court finds sufficient evidence to proceed to trial." The words fell like hammer blows in the quiet courtroom, each syllable another nail in the coffin of his career. Darius stood straight, refusing to bow his head despite the weight pressing down on his shoulders. Behind him, he could hear his mother's quiet prayer, a whispered lifeline in this nightmare, her faith a beacon in the darkness that was closing in around him. The morning sun cast long shadows through the courthouse windows as Mr. Henry Williams sat outside the public defender's office, his weathered hands gripping his wooden cane. The familiar sounds of shuffling papers and clicking heels echoed through the hallway, punctuated by the distant chime of the elevator. After 40 years in these halls, he knew every creak, every whisper, every rhythm of the building's daily life. Even the morning janitor's squeaky cart had its own particular melody. Christopher Langston arrived 20 minutes late, his footsteps heavy with exhaustion. Henry recognized the scent of cheap coffee and the rustle of an oversized briefcase, along with the faint smell of yesterday's takeout lingering on his clothes. "Mr. Langston," Henry called out, his voice steady and clear. "I need to speak with you about Darius Coleman's case." Langston barely paused, keys jingling as he fumbled with his office door. "Look, Mr. Henry, I've got 3 cases this morning and—" "This can't wait." Henry's cane tapped against the floor as he stood, the sound echoing in the empty hallway. "That young man is innocent." Inside Langston's cramped office, papers scattered across every surface, Henry could smell the mustiness of old files and stale air. Coffee rings stained abandoned cups, and a half-eaten sandwich from yesterday sat forgotten on the windowsill. He heard Langston drop heavily into his chair, the ancient springs protesting under his weight. "Mr. Henry, I appreciate your concern, but what could you possibly—" "I heard everything." Henry's voice cut through the air like a knife. "Everything Judge Kensington and Richard Langley said in that chamber." Langston's chair creaked as he leaned back, the leather crackling with age. "You're blind, Mr. Henry. No jury's going to—" Henry's hand slammed down on the desk, making coffee cups rattle and sending a pen rolling to the floor. "I may be blind, but I am not deaf. You're going to listen to me, son." The room fell silent except for the gentle whir of an ancient ceiling fan, its blades casting rotating shadows across the cluttered office. Henry leaned forward, his unseeing eyes somehow finding Langston's face with uncanny precision. 2 nights ago, I was cleaning outside Kensington's chambers. They thought they were alone. I heard Kensington tell Langley how they'd frame Coleman, how they'd doctor the evidence, every detail, every plan. Henry's fingers traced the edge of the desk as he spoke, his voice low but intense. Langston's breath caught slightly, his tie rustling as he swallowed hard. "Mr. Henry, you're talking about going up against the most powerful judge in the city. And you're talking about letting an innocent man go to prison because you're scared." The words hung heavy in the air like storm clouds. Henry heard Langston's fingers drumming nervously on his desk, a rapid staccato of uncertainty. "I know you're scared," Henry continued, his voice softening with understanding. "But are you willing to let an innocent man go to prison because of fear?" The drumming stopped. Papers shuffled as Langston shifted in his chair, the wheels squeaking against the linoleum floor. For a long moment, neither man spoke, the weight of decision pressing down on them both. Finally, Langston released a heavy sigh, and Henry heard him rubbing his temples, the soft scratch of stubble against his palms. "All right, I'll look into it. But if we're going to do this, we need more than just your word." The fluorescent lights flickered and buzzed in the cramped basement office as Christopher Langston dialed a familiar number, his fingers trembling slightly with urgency. Raven Castillo answered on the first ring, her voice sharp and professional as always. "Castillo speaking." "Raven, I need your help. This is about the Coleman case." His voice carried the weight of sleepless nights and mounting pressure. "The cop who planted evidence, it's all over the news. They're crucifying him on every channel." "Sir." "That's just it. I don't think he did it. Can you come in now? It's important." 20 minutes later, Raven strode into the office, her dark hair pulled back in a tight bun, laptop tucked under her arm. Her heels clicked against the worn linoleum floor as she walked in. Her eyes were bright with curiosity as Langston explained the situation, gesturing animatedly. "A blind janitor overheard Judge Kensington plotting to frame Officer Coleman," Langston said, running his fingers through his disheveled hair. Dark circles under his eyes betrayed his exhaustion. "I need proof. Real proof. Something concrete. Can you access the courthouse security footage?" Raven cracked her knuckles, a determined smile playing at her lips. "Give me time and coffee. Lots of coffee. This could take a while." For the next 4 hours, Raven sat hunched over her laptop, methodically combing through footage, her face illuminated by the screen's blue glow. The office grew darker as afternoon shadows crept across the walls, making the space feel even more claustrophobic. Empty coffee cups littered her desk, testament to their determination. Langston paced behind her like a caged tiger, occasionally peering over her shoulder, his nervous energy filling the small room. "Wait!" Raven's hand shot up, freezing Langston mid-step. Her fingers flew across the keyboard with practiced precision, rewinding the footage frame by frame. "There, last Tuesday, 11:47 p.m., look at this." The grainy black and white footage showed a familiar figure moving through the empty courthouse hallway, checking his surroundings. Judge Kensington, looking over his shoulder like a guilty man, slipped into the evidence room. Minutes later, he emerged, hastily tucking something into his jacket pocket. "Look at the timestamp," Raven said, her voice tight with excitement, pointing at the corner of the screen. "This was the night before the evidence against Coleman appeared. It can't be a coincidence." Langston leaned closer, squinting at the screen, his heart pounding. "Can you enhance it? We need to be absolutely certain." "Already on it." Raven's fingers danced across the keyboard, her expertise evident in every keystroke. The image sharpened, revealing Kensington clearly placing an envelope into the evidence locker, his movements quick and furtive. "This is it," she breathed, grabbing her phone with shaking hands. "You need to see this. Right now, this changes everything." Langston stared at the footage, his face draining of color as the implications sank in. Years of defending the seemingly indefensible had left him cynical. But this was different. This was irrefutable proof of corruption at the highest level, caught on camera. "We've got him," Raven whispered, her eyes still fixed on the screen, reflecting the damning evidence before them. Langston straightened up, adjusting his tie with newfound purpose. "This isn't just about Darius anymore," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "This is about exposing a system that's been broken for years, and now we can prove it." The night air was crisp and cool as Mr. Henry made his way down the familiar sidewalk, his cane tapping rhythmically against the concrete. After 40 years of walking these streets, he knew every crack, every uneven spot, every corner by heart. But tonight felt different. The usual comfort of his routine was replaced by an unsettling sensation crawling up his spine. Even the evening sounds, the distant hum of traffic, the rustle of leaves, the occasional dog bark, seemed muted, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Someone was watching him. He could feel it. His acute hearing picked up footsteps behind him. Too measured, too careful to be casual passers-by. They were matching his pace, staying just far enough back to think they weren't noticed. The soft scuff of rubber soles against concrete told him there were at least two of them. Henry's grip tightened on his cane as he turned the corner into the alley near his building, a shortcut he'd taken thousands of times before. The familiar smell of damp brick and garbage filled his nostrils. The attack came swift and brutal. Strong hands grabbed him from behind, fingers digging into his shoulders as he was slammed against the rough brick wall. His cane clattered to the ground, the sound echoing off the narrow walls. Before he could cry out, a second attacker drove a fist into his ribs, knocking the wind from his lungs. The impact sent shockwaves through his entire body. "Stay quiet," a harsh voice whispered in his ear, hot breath against his skin. "No one needs to know what you heard." The voice was trying to sound tough, but Henry caught the slight tremor of nervousness underneath. Henry struggled against their grip, but another punch to his side made him double over in pain. His chest burned with each ragged breath. He felt them yanking his bag away, the bag containing his cassette recorder and all his carefully written notes in Braille. The strap caught on his shoulder before snapping with a sharp crack. The first attacker shoved him hard, sending him sprawling onto the cold pavement. His palms scraped against the rough ground as he tried to break his fall. He could taste blood from his split lip, feel the sting of bruises forming on his face and ribs. The metallic tang of blood filled his mouth. Quick footsteps echoed through the alley as the attackers fled with his bag, leaving him alone in the darkness he'd known his whole life. But this darkness felt heavier somehow, filled with the weight of what had just happened. The sound of their retreat grew fainter until it merged with the distant city noise. Henry pushed himself up slowly, every movement sending sharp pains through his body. His hand found the brick wall, and he used it to steady himself as he got to his feet. His fingers gently touched his face, feeling the swelling around his eye and the warm trickle of blood from his lip. Each breath was a struggle, suggesting at least one bruised rib. Standing there in that alley, beaten but unbroken, Henry let out a short, bitter laugh. "They think this will shut me up," he muttered through gritted teeth. "They don't know me at all." Despite the pain, his voice carried a steel-like determination that echoed off the alley walls. The fluorescent lights in the prison corridor buzzed incessantly as Darius lay on his thin mattress, staring at the gray ceiling above him. His mind raced through every moment that led him here. The arrest, Travis's smirk, Judge Kensington's calculating eyes, Janelle walking away. Sleep had been impossible for days now, replaced by a gnawing ache in his chest and questions that wouldn't stop spinning. The constant drip of a leaky faucet down the hall only added to his restlessness. The sound of heavy boots echoing down the corridor broke through his thoughts. A guard appeared, his face a mask of indifference beneath the harsh lighting. "This came for you," he muttered, barely glancing at Darius as he tossed a small white envelope through the bars. It landed with a soft pad on the concrete floor, skidding slightly before coming to rest. Darius sat up slowly, eyeing the envelope with growing unease. His name was typed on the front. No return address, no markings, just stark black letters against white paper. His hands trembled slightly as he picked it up, feeling the thin paper between his fingers. Something about it made his stomach tighten into knots. He tore it open carefully, pulling out a single sheet of paper that felt oddly heavy in his hands. The message was short, typed in plain black letters that seemed to burn into his vision. "Stop fighting. Drop the case. You won't get out of this." If you keep pushing, consequences will follow. The paper crinkled as his fingers clenched around it, the sound sharp in the quiet cell. His heart pounded against his ribs, each beat accompanied by a surge of anger that spread through his chest like wildfire. This wasn't just a message, it was a threat, plain and simple. Someone was scared enough of what he might do that they felt the need to warn him off, to try to silence him. Standing up, Darius walked to the bars of his cell, gripping them until his knuckles turned white against his dark skin. The crumpled note was still clutched in his fist, a reminder of everything he was fighting against. Was it Kensington who sent this? Langley? Or someone even higher up, pulling strings he couldn't even see from his cramped cell? The threat should have frightened him. Maybe that's what they were counting on. Instead, it lit a fire in his chest that burned away any trace of fear. They thought they could intimidate him into silence, make him give up and accept their lies. A bitter laugh escaped his throat, echoing slightly in the empty corridor. They clearly didn't know who they were dealing with, didn't understand what it meant to have nothing left to lose. His grip tightened on the bars as determination coursed through him, steadying his shaking hands. He was done being their victim. Done watching his life get torn apart while they sat in their comfortable offices thinking they were untouchable. If they wanted him to back down, they'd just made a serious mistake. This threat was proof they were worried, and they should be. "They think I'm just going to roll over," he whispered to himself, his voice hard with resolve. Not a chance. The words hung in the air like a promise, and for the first time in days, Darius felt something close to hope. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room made Mr. Henry's head throb as he regained consciousness. His entire body felt like it had been run over by a truck, then backed over again for good measure. Every breath sent sharp pains through his ribs, and his face felt swollen and tender, like an overripe fruit ready to burst. "Easy there, Mr. Williams," a gentle voice said. "You need to stay still. Your body's been through quite an ordeal." Nurse Lillian Carter adjusted his pillow with practiced hands, her movements precise and gentle. She was a veteran of the night shift, having seen plenty of assault victims in her 20 years of service. But something about this elderly blind man touched her heart particularly deeply. Maybe it was the quiet dignity he maintained even in his battered state. "You're lucky to be alive," she said softly, checking his IV line. "Those animals did quite a number on you. 2 cracked ribs, severe bruising all over your torso, and a nasty cut on your lip that needed stitches." Henry tried to sit up but immediately regretted it as pain shot through his chest like lightning. "My belongings," he managed to say through clenched teeth tasting copper. "Where are they?" "I'm sorry, Mr. Williams. You were brought in with nothing except the clothes on your back. The police report says it was likely a robbery. They found you in the alley behind Mason Street." Henry's heart sank into his stomach. His cassette recorder, his careful notes, all gone. They'd taken everything he could use to help Darius. The attackers knew exactly what they were after. This wasn't some random mugging, it was a calculated move to silence him. But then a memory flickered in his mind, clear as day, like a beacon of hope cutting through his pain. 2 weeks ago, he'd made a backup recording, just in case. He'd hidden it behind the loose brick in his janitor's closet at the courthouse, a habit he'd developed over 40 years of witnessing things he wasn't supposed to see, or in his case, hear. The same instinct that had kept him alive all these years had prompted him to make that copy. Despite the pain screaming through his body, Henry began to swing his legs over the side of the bed. The movement sent waves of agony through his chest, but he had to get to that tape before someone else found it. "Mr. Williams," Nurse Carter exclaimed, rushing to his side with quick steps. "What do you think you're doing? You're in no condition to leave. You need at least 24 hours of observation." "Sometimes, miss," Henry said, grimacing as he pushed himself to sit upright, his hands trembling with the effort. "A man has to do what's right, even when his body's telling him otherwise. Some things are more important than comfort. But you need rest. Your injuries could get worse if you—" "What I need," Henry interrupted firmly, his voice carrying the weight of decades of conviction, "is to finish what I started. There's an innocent man counting on me whether he knows it or not, and I won't let him down." He could feel the nurse's concerned gaze on him as he carefully tested his weight on his feet. The floor felt cold through his thin hospital socks, sending a shiver up his spine, but he forced himself to stand straight despite the stabbing pain in his ribs. Each movement was a battle against his protesting body. "At least let me get you some pain medication before you go," Nurse Carter pleaded, recognizing the unmistakable determination in his face. She knew that look. It was the same one she'd seen on parents rushing to their injured children, on people fighting impossible odds. Henry nodded gratefully, sweat beading on his forehead from the simple effort of standing. He knew he'd need it for what lay ahead. The backup tape was his last chance to expose Judge Kensington's corruption and bring down his house of lies. He couldn't let Darius down, not when he was the only one who could prove the young officer's innocence. Sometimes justice needed a helping hand, even if that hand was bruised and shaking. The afternoon sun filtered through the dusty blinds of Christopher Langston's cramped office, casting long shadows across stacks of case files and legal documents. Langston sat behind his desk, tie loosened, sleeves rolled up, staring at the security footage frozen on his laptop screen. Across from him, Raven Castillo paced back and forth, her heels clicking against the worn linoleum floor. "This footage proves Kensington was there," Raven said, stopping to lean over Langston's shoulder. "But any half-decent lawyer will argue he had legitimate reasons to access the evidence room." Langston rubbed his temples. "They'll say he was reviewing evidence for another case. We need something concrete. A confession, documentation, anything that proves direct interference." "What about phone records?" Raven suggested, settling into a chair. "Between Kensington and Richard Langley? They're too smart for that. Everything important would have been discussed in person." Langston's voice carried the weight of years fighting losing battles in court. The phone on his desk rang, startling them both. Langston hit the speaker button. "Public Defender's Office." "Mr. Langston?" The voice was weak but determined. "It's Henry Williams." "Mr. Henry? Should you be calling? I heard about the attack." "Listen to me," Henry interrupted, his breathing labored. "I need you and Ms. Castillo to come to the hospital right now. I still have something that can end this once and for all." Raven and Langston exchanged glances. "What do you mean?" Langston asked. "Not over the phone. Just come. Room 412. Hurry." 20 minutes later, they stood beside Henry's hospital bed. His face was bruised, one eye swollen shut, but his good eye burned with intensity. "They took my recorder," Henry said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But they didn't know about the backup tape." "Backup tape?" Raven leaned forward. "I've worked at that courthouse for 40 years. You think I don't know how to protect myself?" A small smile crossed Henry's battered face. "After I heard Kensington and Langley that night, I made 2 recordings. The second one is hidden in my supply closet behind the loose brick near the floor." Langston's heart began to race. "And it has everything? The conversation about framing Darius?" "Everything," Henry confirmed. "Clear as day. Kensington, Langley, the whole plot." "Why didn't you tell us about this before?" Raven asked. "Because I'm not a fool. Never keep all your evidence in one place." Henry reached out, finding Langston's hand and gripping it with surprising strength. "You need to get that tape before they do, or everything is lost." The morning sun streamed through the tall courthouse windows, casting harsh shadows across the packed courtroom. Every wooden bench creaked under the weight of spectators, reporters clutched their notepads, and uniformed officers lined the walls. The air felt thick with tension and whispered conversations. Judge Walter Kensington swept into the room, his black robes flowing behind him as he ascended to his bench. His face held the faintest trace of a smirk as he adjusted his reading glasses. The bailiff's voice boomed through the chamber. "All rise." The heavy doors opened again and Darius Coleman shuffled in, the chains around his wrists and ankles clinking with each step. His orange jumpsuit seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights. Despite his shackles, he held his head high, scanning the crowd until he found his mother's face. Evelyn Coleman sat in the front row, her hands clasped in prayer, tears streaming down her cheeks. Their eyes met, and Darius felt his heart constrict. "Let's proceed," Kensington announced, his voice carrying authority that silenced the murmurs. Given the severity of these charges and the clear evidence before us, I see no reason for further delay." The prosecutor stood, a sleek laptop and projector ready. "Your Honor, we have surveillance footage that clearly shows Officer Coleman planting evidence in Mr. Langley's vehicle." The doctored video played on the wall. Darius watched himself, or rather, the carefully edited version of himself, appearing to slip something into Travis Langley's car. His fingernails dug into his palms as rage built inside him. The truth burned in his throat, begging to be shouted, but he knew it would only make things worse. Minutes ticked by and still no sign of Langston or Raven. The prosecution continued presenting their fabricated case, each piece of evidence more outrageous than the last. Darius felt the noose tightening around his neck with every passing moment. Just as Kensington leaned forward to deliver his verdict, the courtroom doors burst open. Christopher Langston stumbled in, his suit wrinkled, his briefcase clutched desperately to his chest. He was breathing hard as if he'd run up several flights of stairs. "Your Honor, Langston started, but Kensington cut him off with a wave of his hand. "You're too late, Mr. Langston," Kensington declared, his voice dripping with false regret. "This court has reviewed all necessary evidence." He cleared his throat and straightened his papers. "Based on the overwhelming evidence presented, this court finds the defendant, Darius Coleman, guilty of all charges." The courtroom erupted. Reporters jumped to their feet, cameras flashing. Officers moved to restrain Evelyn Coleman as she cried out, "No, not my baby!" The sound of her anguish cut through the chaos like a knife. As the bailiffs moved to take Darius away, he caught sight of Mr. Henry Williams standing at the back of the courtroom. The elderly janitor's face was bruised and swollen, but his unseeing eyes seemed to bore straight into Darius's soul. In that moment, something inside Darius hardened into steel. His shoulders straightened, his jaw set firm. They thought they'd broken him, but they had no idea how wrong they were. The harsh fluorescent lights flickered in Darius's prison cell, casting an eerie glow across the concrete walls. He sat on the thin mattress, his back against the cold wall, replaying the moment Judge Kensington had sealed his fate. The metal chains that had bound his wrists and ankles during transport might be gone, but their phantom weight still pressed against his skin. From somewhere down the cell block, angry shouts and curses echoed off the walls. But Darius heard none of it. All he could hear was his mother's heartbreaking sobs as the verdict was read, the sound cutting deeper than any knife could reach. The image of Evelyn Coleman's tear-streaked face, her hands trembling as she reached for him, was burned into his memory. His fingers traced the rough prison uniform, so different from the police uniform he'd worn with pride just weeks ago. The orange fabric felt like sandpaper against his skin, a constant reminder of how far he'd fallen. But it wasn't self-pity that filled his heart. It was rage. Pure, focused rage at the corruption that had put him here. The image of Mr. Henry's battered face in the courtroom made his stomach clench. The elderly janitor had shown up despite his injuries, his swollen face and split lip telling the story of what happened to those who dared to stand up against Judge Kensington. Yet Henry had still come, had still tried to help, even after being attacked. The old man's courage stirred something deep inside Darius. Heavy footsteps approached his cell. A guard appeared, his face expressionless as he tossed a small piece of paper through the bars. It fluttered to the ground like a wounded bird. Darius waited until the guard's footsteps faded before reaching for it with trembling fingers. The paper was torn from a legal pad, folded into a tiny square. His heart pounded as he carefully unfolded it, revealing 5 simple words written in neat handwriting. "Hold on. We're coming for you." The note wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. Whether it was Langston or Raven who had sent it, the message was clear. He wasn't alone in this fight. Someone on the outside still believed in him, still fought for him. Darius sat up straighter, his jaw set with determination. He looked at the note again, feeling strength flow back into his limbs. The system might have knocked him down, but they hadn't knocked him out. Not yet. Not while people like Henry, Langston, and Raven still stood in his corner. He clenched the paper in his fist, his voice barely above a whisper but filled with steel. "They want a fight? I'll give them one." The early morning silence of the courthouse echoes with Mr. Henry's labored footsteps. His ribs protest with each movement, reminding him of the brutal attack he endured. Gripping his white cane in one hand and holding his side with the other, he makes his way through the empty halls, his shoes squeaking against the freshly waxed floor. Just a little further, he mutters to himself, counting the steps he's taken thousands of times before. 23 steps from the side entrance, turn left, 12 more to the supply closet. The familiar smell of cleaning supplies greets him as he enters the small space. His hands, weathered but sure, move across the shelves with practiced precision. Bleach bottles, mop heads, paper towels. He knows the location of everything by touch alone. Come on, where are you? His fingers brush against something in the back corner of the highest shelf. An old shoebox covered in dust. Henry pulls it down carefully, his heart racing despite the pain in his chest. Inside, beneath some rags, his fingers find what they're seeking, the smooth plastic case of a cassette tape. He runs his thumb across the label, feeling the raised letters he'd carefully made with his label maker. Judge's office, night of setup. Clutching the tape close to his chest, Henry makes his way to courtroom 3, the one he knows is always empty this early. The sound of his cane tapping against the floor seems too loud in the silence, but he can't move any faster with his injuries. Inside the courtroom, Henry pulls out an old cassette player from his jacket pocket. His hands shake slightly as he inserts the tape. The familiar click and whir of the mechanism starting up fills him with both hope and dread. At first, there's only static, then shuffling sounds. Henry turns up the volume slightly, holding his breath. Judge Kensington's voice suddenly fills the empty courtroom, clear and damning. Darius Coleman, he's finished. I made sure of it. That envelope, it's all set. When they find it, he'll never wear a badge again. Henry's fingers tremble as he stops the tape. This is it. The evidence they need. The proof that could save Darius and expose Kensington's corruption. He carefully removes the cassette and tucks it into his coat's inner pocket, patting it to make sure it's secure. Standing slowly, wincing at the pain in his ribs, Henry grips his cane and makes his way toward the exit. Each step feels lighter now, despite his injuries. He has what they need. Now he just has to get it to Langston. A shadow moves in the hallway, but Henry, focused on his mission and limited by his blindness, doesn't notice as he continues his determined path toward the courthouse exit. Christopher Langston's office felt like a tomb that morning. Papers were scattered across his desk, coffee cups littered every surface, and the weight of defeat hung heavy in the air. Raven Castillo sat slumped in a chair, her usually pristine appearance disheveled after hours of fruitless searching. "We've got nothing," Langston muttered, running his fingers through his unkempt hair. Without that security footage. He couldn't finish the sentence. The thought of Darius rotting in prison made his stomach turn. The sudden bang of his office door flying open made them both jump. Mr. Henry Williams stumbled in, his face still bruised, one hand clutching his ribs. His breathing came in ragged gasps. "Mr. Henry!" Raven rushed to help him into a chair. "You shouldn't be out of the hospital." Henry waved off her concern, his unseeing eyes bright with determination. With trembling hands, he reached into his coat and pulled out an old cassette tape. He slammed it onto Langston's desk with surprising force. "I got it," he wheezed. "That dirty judge's confession. Every word." Langston stared at the tape like it was made of gold. His hands shook as he grabbed his old tape player from the bottom drawer. The click of the tape being inserted seemed to echo in the tense silence. Then Kensington's voice filled the room, clear and damning. "Darius Coleman. He's finished. I made sure of it. That envelope? It's all set. When they find it, he'll never wear a badge again." Raven's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. More damning statements followed. Kensington discussing payment with Richard Langley, laughing about how easy it was to frame an innocent man. Langston felt his heart hammering in his chest. After weeks of despair, of watching an innocent man get railroaded by the system, they finally had something concrete, something real. "This changes everything," he said, a smile spreading across his face for the first time in days. He jumped up, grabbing his coat from the back of his chair. "We need to get this to the court. Now." The old tape player continued to play, spilling out more of Kensington's arrogant confessions. Mr. Henry sat back in his chair, a satisfied smile on his battered face. Despite his injuries, despite everything they'd put him through, he'd won. He'd gotten the truth. Raven was already on her phone, typing furiously. "I'm calling the DA's office. They need to hear this immediately." Langston gathered the tape and his briefcase, his mind racing with the legal implications. This wasn't just evidence. This was a smoking gun. This was everything they needed to free Darius and bring down Judge Kensington's corrupt empire. The afternoon sun glinted off the news station's glass facade as Langston's car screeched into the parking lot. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his heart pounding with equal parts fear and determination. Beside him, Raven clutched the cassette tape to her chest like it was a precious jewel. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The courthouse would be more official." "The courthouse is Kensington's playground," Langston replied, killing the engine. "We need to go bigger." Inside the station, the bustling newsroom hummed with activity. Reporters hunched over computers, phones rang constantly, and the wall-mounted TVs displayed various news channels. Langston marched straight to the receptionist's desk. "We need to see Benjamin Carter now." The receptionist started to object, but something in Langston's eyes made her pause. She picked up her phone, dialed, and spoke quietly. Minutes later, they were ushered into Carter's office. Benjamin Carter looked exactly like what Langston expected from a veteran journalist. Salt and pepper hair, reading glasses perched on his nose, and eyes that had seen too much corruption to be naive anymore. He leaned back in his chair, studying them. "Make it quick," Carter said. "I've got a broadcast in 30 minutes. Langston placed the tape recorder on Carter's desk. "What I'm about to play, you will blow up the entire justice system in this city." The tape crackled to life. Kensington's voice filled the room, clear and damning. Carter's expression changed as he listened, from skepticism to surprise, then to barely contained rage. By the time the recording ended, he was already reaching for his phone. "Get me Sarah and Mike," he barked into the receiver. "Now, and clear tonight's primetime slot." He turned to Langston and Raven. "This isn't just corruption. This is systematic abuse of power. A respected officer framed, a judge caught red-handed." He shook his head. "We're running this tonight." Outside the station, a black SUV idled across the street. Inside, a man in an expensive suit pulled out his phone. His voice was cold as he delivered the message. "Kensington isn't going to like this." Back in Carter's office, reporters began filing in. They huddled around Carter's desk, listening to the tape, taking furious notes. Carter was already outlining the broadcast schedule. "This goes live at 8, he announced. "Full coverage, no holds barred." As Langston and Raven headed for the door, Carter called after them. "You just started a war." They stepped into the hallway, the weight of what they'd just done settling over them. The truth was finally going to come out, if they could keep the tape safe until tonight. The fluorescent lights in the prison corridor cast harsh shadows as Darius sat cross-legged on his narrow bunk, eyes fixed on the small TV mounted high in the corner. His cellmate had stopped complaining about wanting to watch something else when he saw how intensely Darius was focused on the screen. "Coming up next, a breaking news exclusive." The news anchor's voice made Darius's heart skip a beat. He leaned forward, hands clasped tightly together. The familiar face of Benjamin Carter appeared on screen, his expression grave as he looked directly into the camera. "Good evening. Tonight we bring you undeniable evidence of a shocking corruption scandal that has rocked our city's justice system." Carter held up a cassette tape, its plastic casing catching the studio lights. "What you're about to hear is Judge Walter Kensington, in his own words, admitting to framing an innocent police officer." The recording began to play. Kensington's unmistakable voice filled the prison block, causing several inmates to stop their card games and look up at the TV. "Darius Coleman, he's finished. I made sure of it. That envelope, it's all set. When they find it, he'll never wear a badge again." Across town in her modest living room, Evelyn Coleman sank to her knees in front of her television set. "Oh, Lord Jesus," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Thank you. Thank you. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone to call her prayer circle. In his mansion study, Judge Kensington stood frozen, watching his own voice betray him on national television. The crystal tumbler in his hand shattered against the stone fireplace, sending shards of glass and bourbon flying. "No!" he screamed, face contorted with rage. "No!" The broadcast continued relentlessly, laying out the entire conspiracy. Benjamin Carter's voice was steady and authoritative as he presented document after document, testimony after testimony. Back in his cell, Darius could hardly breathe. Other inmates were calling out to him now. "Hey, Coleman, they did you dirty. Man, that judge is going down." The night seemed endless. Darius couldn't sleep, watching replay after replay of the broadcast on different news channels. By morning, the story had exploded. Phone lines at the courthouse were jammed. Social media was flooded with calls for justice. The district attorney's office released an emergency statement. In light of new evidence, we are immediately moving to review the case against former officer Darius Coleman. At 6:45 a.m., heavy footsteps echoed down the prison corridor. A guard Darius didn't recognize appeared at his cell door, keys jingling in his hand. "Get up, Coleman," the guard said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "You've got a retrial." The morning sun streamed through the tall courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the packed courtroom. Every seat was filled, with reporters clutching notepads and community members whispering among themselves. The air felt electric with anticipation. Judge Walter Kensington sat at his bench, his usually confident demeanor showing cracks. His fingers drummed nervously on the wooden surface as he watched the bailiff lead Darius into the courtroom. For the first time since his arrest, Darius walked in without shackles, his head held high. In the front row, Evelyn Coleman clutched her worn Bible, her eyes never leaving her son. Tears glistened on her cheeks, but she managed a warm smile when Darius glanced her way. The Bible's pages were marked with dozens of sticky notes, passages she'd been praying over during her son's imprisonment. Christopher Langston rose from the defense table, his movements deliberate and confident. He held up the cassette tape, its plastic casing reflecting the overhead lights. "Your Honor, the defense would like to present new evidence." The prosecutor jumped to his feet. "Objection! This evidence wasn't properly submitted." But the district attorney, sitting behind him, tugged at his sleeve and shook his head. They both knew what was coming. The damage was already done. Langston inserted the tape into a player connected to the courtroom speaker system. The room fell silent as Kensington's voice filled the air, clear and unmistakable. "Darius Coleman? He's finished. I made sure of it. That envelope? It's all set. When they find it, he'll never wear a badge again." Gasps erupted throughout the courtroom. A photographer's camera clicked rapidly, capturing Kensington's face as it drained of color. Several jurors leaned forward, their expressions shifting from shock to anger. The heavy courtroom doors swung open. Special Agent Monica Reyes led a team of federal agents down the center aisle, their badges gleaming. Her heels clicked against the marble floor as she approached the bench, pulling an arrest warrant from her jacket. "Judge Walter Kensington," she announced, her voice carrying through the now silent courtroom. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, evidence tampering, and obstruction of justice." Two agents moved behind the bench. Kensington's face contorted with rage as they pulled him to his feet. The handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists, the same sound that had haunted Darius for weeks. As the agents led him past the defense table, Kensington locked eyes with Darius. His voice dripped with venom. "You'll regret this, Coleman." Darius stood tall, meeting his gaze steadily. A smile spread across his face, the first genuine smile in weeks. "No," he replied calmly. "I won't." The afternoon sun cast a warm glow across the prison's concrete walls as Darius stood in the processing room, his heart beating steadily. The guard behind the counter pushed a plastic bag toward him, containing the pieces of his former life. His fingers trembled slightly as he opened it. Inside, he found his wallet, still containing the same worn photos and receipts from that fateful day. Next came his watch, Janelle's engagement gift to him, The silver face caught the fluorescent light, reminding him of happier times. At the bottom of the bag lay his badge, its golden surface dulled from months in storage. Darius lifted the badge, its weight familiar yet somehow different now. He studied the numbers etched into its surface, remembering how proud he'd been the day he earned it. After a long moment, he set it aside on the counter. Some chapters had to end for new ones to begin. "You're all set, Mr. Coleman," the guard said, sliding him the final release papers. Walking through the prison corridors for the last time felt surreal. Each step brought him closer to freedom, the sound of his civilian shoes echoing against the concrete floors. The heavy metal doors buzzed open one by one until finally, he stepped out into the bright afternoon air. His mother stood waiting by her old blue sedan, her hands clasped together in prayer. When she saw him, her face crumpled with joy. "My baby," she cried, running toward him with outstretched arms. Darius caught her in a tight embrace, feeling her tears soaking into his shirt. His own eyes welled up as he held her, breathing in the familiar scent of her perfume. "I never lost faith," she whispered, squeezing him tighter. "Not for 1 second." A few feet away stood the unlikely team that had fought for his freedom. Christopher Langston, looking more relaxed than Darius had ever seen him, stood with his hands in his pockets. Beside him, Raven Castillo smiled warmly, her investigator's notebook tucked under her arm. And there was Mr. Henry Williams, leaning on his cane, his face still bearing the marks of his brutal attack, but wearing a triumphant grin. "Told you the truth would come out," Henry said, his voice strong despite his injuries. "Truth's like that. You can try to bury it, but it always finds its way to the light." Darius walked over to them, taking Langston's extended hand in a firm handshake. "I can't thank you enough," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "All of you." Langston shook his head, smiling. "It wasn't just me. It was all of us. Sometimes justice needs a whole team to make it work." Looking up at the vast blue sky above him, Darius took a deep breath. The air tasted different now, sweeter, cleaner, filled with possibility. For the first time in months, he was truly free. The evening sky painted streaks of purple and orange as Darius stood outside Mr. Henry's modest apartment building. His knuckles hesitated for a moment before rapping on the worn wooden door. The sound of shuffling feet approached, and the door creaked open to reveal Mr. Henry, his face still showing the marks of his brave stand against corruption. "Took you long enough?" Henry chuckled, his unseeing eyes crinkling with warmth. Despite the bruises that mottled his face, his smile was genuine and welcoming. The small apartment was filled with the aroma of home cooking, cornbread and something that smelled like his mother's Sunday stew. Darius followed Henry into the cramped but cozy living room, where 2 bowls sat steaming on a coffee table. "My late wife's recipe," Henry explained, settling into his favorite armchair. "She always said good food makes for better conversation." As they ate, Henry shared stories from his younger days. His voice carried decades of experience, painting pictures of a different time when justice seemed even more elusive. "Back in '65, I watched a good man go to prison because a judge didn't like the color of his skin. Couldn't do anything then, just a young janitor starting out. But I promised myself I'd never stay silent again." Darius listened intently, seeing his own recent struggles reflected in Henry's tales. The old man had witnessed countless injustices from his seemingly invisible position in the courthouse, gathering wisdom from each bitter lesson. "I've seen men like Kensington before," Henry continued, his voice growing serious. "They fall, but there's always another. Different face, same rot underneath." Darius nodded slowly, stirring his stew. "Then we keep fighting." The weight of those words hung in the air between them. Henry's unseeing eyes seemed to look right through him, reading his determination. "The system doesn't change just because one corrupt judge goes down," Henry said, leaning forward in his chair. "But every time someone stands up, every time someone refuses to look away, that's when real change happens. Small steps, but they matter." Darius thought about his badge, still sitting in that plastic bag from the prison. He thought about all the officers who'd turned their backs on him, about Janelle walking away, about his mother's tears. But he also thought about Langston's determination, Raven's tireless work, and this blind janitor who'd risked everything to tell the truth. Henry reached out, finding Darius's shoulder with surprising accuracy. "You got your life back, son. What are you going to do with it?" Darius sat quietly, the question echoing in his mind. The answer was already forming in his heart, but he didn't speak it aloud. The morning sun streamed through the precinct's windows as Darius Coleman stepped through the familiar glass doors. His heart pounded against his chest, each step echoing in his ears. The bustling station fell eerily quiet. Officers who once shared coffee and jokes with him suddenly found their paperwork fascinating. Some whispered behind cupped hands, while others simply turned away. The same desk where he'd written countless reports now felt like a monument to betrayal. His eyes swept across the room, taking in the familiar sights and smells: coffee, printer ink, and floor cleaner. But everything felt different now, tainted by memories of being dragged through these same halls in handcuffs. Near the entrance, Officer Bill Sanders stood awkwardly, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. Their eyes met, and Sanders' face flushed red with shame. After a moment's hesitation, he walked toward Darius, each step seeming to cost him tremendous effort. "I should have stood up for you," Sanders said, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes darted around, checking if others were watching. I was scared, Darius. Scared of losing everything I worked for. Scared of what they'd do to me if I spoke up." Darius stood perfectly still, his face a mask of controlled emotion. The words hung between them like a heavy curtain. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence, marking each uncomfortable second. "I needed a friend, Bill," Darius finally said, his voice steady but filled with hurt. "And you left me to rot." Sanders nodded, running a hand through his graying hair. "I know. God, I know. If there's ever a way I can make it right." Darius studied his former partner's face, the man who'd shared meals with him, watched his back during dangerous calls, but abandoned him when it mattered most. He took a deep breath, letting the anger and disappointment wash through him. "You can't change the past," Darius said firmly, "but you can decide who you are moving forward." Sanders blinked rapidly, fighting back tears. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. As Darius turned to leave, his shoes squeaking slightly on the polished floor, Sanders found his voice. "Are you coming back to the force?" he called out. Darius didn't answer. He kept walking, leaving Sanders and his question hanging in the air behind him. The afternoon sun filtered through the cafe's large windows, casting warm patches of light across the wooden tables. Darius sat alone, his coffee growing cold as he stirred it mindlessly. The events of the past few months weighed heavily on his mind. The betrayal, the isolation, the fight for justice. The cafe buzzed with quiet conversation and the gentle hum of coffee machines. Darius? His hand froze mid-stir. He knew that voice. It had haunted his dreams during those long nights in his prison cell. Slowly, he turned to see Janelle standing there, wearing the blue dress he had always loved. Her hands were clasped tightly together, uncertainty written across her face. Can I sit down?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Darius nodded silently, watching as she slid into the chair across from him. Her hands trembled as she placed them on the table. "I was wrong," Janelle said, her voice cracking with emotion. "I should have believed you. I should have stood by you." Tears welled up in her eyes. "I was scared, Darius. Everything was falling apart and I didn't know what to do." Darius looked down at his coffee, remembering the night she left, her packed bags by the door. The pain felt fresh again, like a wound reopened. "I never stopped loving you," she continued, reaching across the table but stopping short of touching his hand. "Every day, I thought about you. Every night I wondered if you were okay." "I thought you'd fight for me," Darius said softly, finally meeting her eyes. "When everyone else turned their backs, I thought at least you would stay. But you walked away, Janelle. You walked away when I needed you most." A tear rolled down Janelle's cheek. "I want to fix this," she pleaded. "I want us back. We can start over. Rebuild what we had. I know I hurt you, but please, give me another chance." Darius studied her face, the face he'd once known better than his own. He remembered their shared dreams, their plans for the future, the life they were supposed to build together. But he also remembered the crushing weight of her absence during his darkest hours. "When I was in that cell," he said, his voice steady but heavy with emotion, "I had a lot of time to think. About loyalty, about trust, about who stands with you when the whole world is against you." Janelle wiped her tears with trembling fingers. "I know I failed you. But people make mistakes, Darius. We can learn from them, grow stronger." Darius stood up slowly, reaching into his pocket for his wallet. He placed some money on the table for his coffee, then looked at Janelle one final time. Her eyes were pleading, hopeful. "I don't think we can go back," he said quietly. He turned and walked away, leaving Janelle sitting there, tears streaming down her face. The cafe door chimed softly as he stepped out into the afternoon sun. The evening sun cast long shadows across the familiar driveway as Darius pulled up to his childhood home. The porch light glowed warmly, a beacon of comfort he'd desperately missed during his time behind bars. His mother, Evelyn, stood in the doorway, her silhouette a picture of unconditional love and steadfast faith. "Come here, baby," she called out, opening her arms wide. Darius climbed the worn wooden steps, each creak bringing back memories of happier times. When he reached her, Evelyn wrapped him in an embrace so tight it made his chest ache. She smelled like vanilla and cinnamon, the same comforting scent from his childhood. "Mama," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Inside, the house was filled with the aroma of his favorite meal, her famous pot roast with butter beans and cornbread. The kitchen counter was lined with dishes he remembered from Sunday dinners and celebrations. It had been months since she'd cooked this meal, not since before his arrest. "Sit down, baby," Evelyn said, pulling out his usual chair at the dinner table. "Let your mama take care of you tonight." They filled their plates, and for a few moments they ate in comfortable silence. The familiar taste of home-cooked food brought tears to Darius's eyes. He'd dreamed of this moment during those long nights in his cell. "You never doubted me, Mama," Darius said finally, setting down his fork. "Even when everyone else did, Janelle, my partner, the whole department, you stood by me." Evelyn reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. Her palm was warm and soft against his skin. "Because you are my son," she said simply, her eyes shining with pride and love. "And I knew the truth would come out. God doesn't let lies stand forever." Darius squeezed her hand, remembering how she'd visited him every week in prison, bringing her Bible and unwavering faith. "I don't know what I would have done without you, Mama." "You would have survived," she said firmly, "because that's who you are. You're strong, baby. Always have been." They continued eating, sharing memories and quiet moments between bites. Evelyn told him about the prayer circle at church that had kept him in their thoughts. She mentioned how she'd kept his room exactly as he'd left it, waiting for his return. After dinner, as they sat in the living room with cups of sweet tea, Evelyn turned to face him. She reached out and cupped his face in her hands, the way she used to when he was a little boy. Tears glistened in her eyes, but she was smiling. "You're free now, baby," she said softly. "But what are you going to do next?" The morning sun filtered through the dusty windows of Mr. Henry's apartment building as Darius stood outside the familiar door. His knuckles rapped against the worn wood with purpose, though it was barely 7 a.m. He heard shuffling inside, followed by the distinctive tap of Henry's cane. "Didn't expect to see you this early, kid," Henry grumbled good-naturedly as he opened the door, still in his striped pajamas and robe. Despite his words, his face showed a hint of amusement. The apartment was small but cozy, filled with the collected treasures of Henry's 40 years at the courthouse. Old law books lined the shelves, their spines cracked and faded. A worn armchair sat in the corner, clearly Henry's favorite spot, with a small radio perched on the table beside it. The furniture showed its age, but everything was meticulously clean and organized. Darius settled onto the weathered couch while Henry made his way to his armchair, moving carefully as his injuries from the attack were still healing. The morning light cast long shadows across the room, highlighting the determination in Darius's face. "I need your help," Darius said, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. His voice carried the weight of someone who had made an important decision. "I can't just go back to life like nothing happened." Henry's face softened into a knowing smile. He adjusted his position in the chair, wincing slightly from his bruised ribs. "You want to change things, don't you?" "I do," Darius admitted, running a hand over his face. His eyes swept across the room, taking in the law books, the newspaper clippings about justice reform pinned to one wall. "The system is broken. We both know that. What happened to me, it's happening to others too. People without anyone to fight for them." Henry chuckled, leaning back in his chair. His fingers drummed thoughtfully on his cane. "Then let's get to work." The morning light grew stronger, filling the small living room with warmth. Henry reached for his coffee cup, a small smirk playing on his lips. "You ready for a fight, son?" Darius smiled, his first genuine smile in weeks. "I was born ready." The fluorescent lights of the community center buzzed overhead as Darius adjusted his tie for the 10th time. His reflection in the backstage mirror showed a man transformed, not broken by injustice, but strengthened by it. The muffled sounds of the gathering crowd filtered through the heavy curtains. "Nervous?" Mr. Henry's warm voice came from behind him, followed by the tap of his cane on the floor. The older man's face still bore fading bruises from the attack, but his eyes sparkled with pride. Darius let out a shaky laugh. "I've faced prison, corruption, and betrayal. But a microphone? Yeah, that's terrifying." He tugged at his collar, feeling the weight of what he was about to do. "Just speak from your heart, son," Mr. Henry said, placing a firm hand on Darius's shoulder. "That's all these people need to hear." Through a gap in the curtain, Darius could see the packed room. Local news cameras stood ready. Community activists held signs demanding justice reform. Regular citizens filled every chair, their faces expectant. His mother sat in the front row, clutching her Bible and beaming. Taking one final deep breath, Darius stepped onto the stage. The lights felt hot on his face as applause erupted through the room. He gripped the podium, steadying himself. "The system failed me," he began, his voice stronger than he expected. "But I am not the only one." The room fell silent, hanging on his words. How many more innocent men and women sit in prison cells because someone decided their lives didn't matter? His voice cracked slightly with emotion. "I was lucky. I had people who fought for me. But luck should never be a requirement for justice." Heads nodded throughout the crowd. Some people wiped tears from their eyes. Others called out in agreement. "We need real change," Darius continued, gaining confidence. "Not just words, not just promises, but action." Judge Kensington's corruption wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a broken system. The crowd erupted in applause. Darius saw his mother dabbing her eyes with a tissue. Mr. Henry stood at the back of the room, smiling broadly. "I stand before you today not just as a man who was wronged, but as someone who refuses to let that wrong be the end of the story. We need accountability, we need transparency, and most importantly, we need to fight for those who can't fight for themselves." The applause grew louder. People rose to their feet. Camera flashes popped throughout the room. As Darius stepped down from the stage, reporters surged forward, microphones extended. "Mr. Coleman, what's your next step? Are you planning legal action? Will you return to law enforcement?" Darius simply smiled at the cameras. "You'll see." The evening air carried a gentle breeze as Darius and Mr. Henry walked through their old neighborhood. Street lamps cast long shadows across familiar sidewalks, past the corner store where Darius used to buy candy as a kid, and the barbershop where neighborhood men still gathered to debate politics and sports. Mr. Henry's cane tapped rhythmically against the concrete, his steps slower but deliberate. Despite his injuries from the attack, he insisted on walking. "Good for the soul," he'd said when Darius offered to drive. They stopped in front of St. Michael's Church, its weathered brick facade a testament to decades of faithful service to the community. The concrete steps, cracked and worn smooth by countless footsteps, seemed to welcome them like an old friend. "Need a rest?" Darius asked, noticing Henry's slight grimace. "Don't baby me, boy," Henry chuckled, but lowered himself carefully onto the steps. Darius joined him, feeling the cool concrete through his suit pants. Above them, stars peeked through the city's light pollution. A police siren wailed in the distance, and somewhere down the block, children's laughter floated on the evening air. "I never thought I'd be here again," Darius admitted, his voice quiet. "After everything, the arrest, the trial, the betrayals, there were moments in that cell when I thought it was over." Henry nodded, running his hand along the rough surface of the step. "Used to clean these steps every Sunday morning," he remembered. 40 years of service and you learn something. Life's funny like that. Kicks you down, then asks what you're going to do about it." Darius looked at the old church doors, remembering how his mother used to drag him to Sunday service. He'd complained then, but now those memories felt precious, like photographs preserved in amber. "You know what's strange?" Darius said, loosening his tie. "For the first time since this whole mess started, I'm not afraid of what comes next. It's like everything that happened was leading to this moment." Henry smiled, his unseeing eyes turned toward the street. "That's because you finally found your purpose. Sometimes the worst storms blow us right where we need to be." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the neighborhood's evening symphony, distant car horns, the rumble of the elevated train, the rustle of leaves in the church's old oak tree. Mr. Henry patted Darius's back, his weathered hand strong and sure. "You ain't done yet, son," he said with a smile. "This is just the beginning." The morning sun filtered through the coffee shop's large windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floors. Darius pushed open the familiar glass door, hearing the gentle chime that had greeted him countless times before. The aroma of freshly ground coffee beans wrapped around him like an old friend. Behind the counter, Sarah, the barista who'd served him for years, froze mid-motion. Her eyes widened with recognition, then softened with sympathy. She'd seen his story on the news, watched as his name was cleared. "Coffee's on the house, officer," she said warmly, already reaching for his usual order. Dark roast, no sugar. Darius felt a familiar ache in his chest. "Not an officer anymore," he corrected her gently, managing a small smile. Sarah's face flushed. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." "It's okay," he assured her, pulling out his wallet. "But I insist on paying." She nodded, understanding his need for normalcy. As she prepared his coffee, Darius settled into his old spot by the window. The city moved around him in its usual rhythm. People rushing to work, kids heading to school, street vendors setting up their carts. That's when he saw them. 2 officers had stopped a young black teenager wearing a gray hoodie. The kid couldn't have been more than 15, his shoulders tense, hands visible but trembling. Darius recognized that look, the mixture of fear and helplessness that came with being questioned just for existing. Without thinking, Darius stood up. His coffee sat forgotten on the table as he pushed through the door, the bell chiming sharply behind him. He didn't intervene directly. He knew better than that. Instead, he positioned himself nearby, close enough that the officers couldn't miss his presence. One officer glanced his way, then did a double take. Darius met his gaze steadily. He'd been on their side of things once, knew how power could corrupt even good intentions, but he also knew that accountability could change behavior. The teenager kept his responses calm and clear, just like Darius had learned to do growing up. But his eyes darted around nervously until they landed on Darius. Something in the boy's posture changed then. His shoulders straightened slightly. His voice grew more confident. The officer's questions became less aggressive, their stance less threatening. Whether it was Darius's presence or their own conscience, they soon ran out of reasons to hold the kid. "You're free to go," the taller officer said, stepping back. The teenager didn't run, though Darius could tell he wanted to. He walked away with measured steps, the way black parents taught their children. As he passed Darius, he gave a slight nod, a gesture of silent gratitude that spoke volumes. Darius nodded back, his heart heavy with understanding. The exchange lasted only seconds, but it reinforced everything he'd been fighting for. The kid disappeared around the corner, and the officers returned to their patrol car, but Darius remained rooted to the spot. Through the window, he could see his coffee getting cold, Sarah watching him with a mixture of pride and sadness. He knew his work wasn't done. It had only just begun. The evening sky painted streaks of purple and orange across the horizon as Darius stood outside Mr. Henry's modest apartment building. Through the ground floor window, he could see the old man settled in his worn leather recliner, newspapers spread across his lap. The sight made Darius smile. Even after everything that happened, some things stayed exactly the same. A gentle breeze rustled through the trees lining the street. Darius shifted his weight, hands in his pockets, watching as Henry's fingers traced over the newspaper's pages. The old man's face was still bruised from the attack, but his expression remained peaceful, determined. Finally, Darius stepped forward and knocked on the door. 3 sharp raps, their signal. "Come on in," Henry called out, his gravelly voice carrying through the thin door. "Unless you're selling something, then keep walking." Darius chuckled as he entered. The apartment smelled like coffee and old books, a comforting combination he'd grown to associate with wisdom and safety. Henry didn't move from his chair, but his unseeing eyes turned toward the door with perfect accuracy. "Knew it was you?" Henry said. "Got that hesitant knockdown pat?" They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. The ticking of an old clock on the wall marked the passing seconds. Outside, a car honked, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. "I wouldn't have made it without you," Darius finally said, his voice thick with emotion. Henry's face cracked into that familiar smirk. "Nah, son, you saved yourself." Darius shook his head firmly. "Number, you saw the truth before anyone else did." He leaned forward in his chair, elbows on his knees. "When everyone else believed the lies, you knew. You risked everything. Your job, your safety, your life. For me." Henry's expression softened, the wrinkles around his eyes deepening. "You never needed eyes to see the truth, son." He set his newspaper aside, turning fully toward Darius's voice. "Truth ain't about what you see. It's about what you know in your heart." Darius grinned, shaking his head. "You always got a lesson, don't you?" Henry's laugh filled the small room, warm and genuine. "Somebody's got to keep you in line." Standing up, Darius took one last look at the man who had changed his life, the blind janitor who had seen more clearly than anyone else. Henry remained in his chair, a slight smile playing on his lips, as Darius stepped out into the night. If you enjoyed the story of Darius, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.